Yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce Prem Chandavarkar, an old friend and colleague. And he doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll still go ahead because it's a pleasure to do that. Prem is an architect practicing out of Bangalore, and he has been um, exploring a different model of practice. So, on his practice side, there is a kind of innovative idea of collaboration. Um, he also has taught and continues to teach in many, many different places and has been a foremost kind of thinker in the field of education, architectural education, especially in India and elsewhere. Um, in the last few years, he's been writing a blog, which I consider to be one of the most useful series of discussions and thoughts. And in that sense, he's distinguished himself as a public intellectual in India. We are very happy that Prem is with us today, and we look forward to a very thought provoking talk. Prem, welcome.
Thanks, Chaya, for that generous introduction. And it's an honor to be here at the Porsche studio, which is, I think, an experiment in architectural education that all of us are eagerly watching. And I think it's going to be quite trend setting. And I feel a bit intimidated by the lineup of other speakers in this lecture series. And it's a lot to live up to. I'll do my best. So this is a study that was provoked by the proposed redevelopment of Central Vista. And looking at when I first started evaluating that, I realized one needed to ask a series of questions. One is, how was the original design meant to serve as a public symbol of imperial power and governance? Because it was a colonial construction meant to mark British Empire. And And then how has it been appropriated by Indians to make it a part of their history? Because we've had over 70 years since independence where we made it our own. We didn't, although it was a colonial construction, we chose not to demolish it, but to appropriate it. And what does the current redevelopment signify? And then I realized to ask these questions, it was necessary to ask a broader question in the architecture of capitals, how are political ideals represented in urban form? And to do this, it required a historical analysis, not just looking across time, going backward in time to trace origins, but also in a segment of time to look at parallels. Especially Central Vista is an urban typology called the Grand Urban Axis. And this typology was a major feature in making capital cities from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, and which is a period within which the creation of Central Vista is situated. So to start with this idea of the representation of governance in the history of urban design, until the medieval city, it was fairly easy to represent political power because there was a single center, which would typically be a palace or a fort or a temple or a mosque or a church, and the governance of the city was seen to emanate from there. Sometimes it would be more than one monument. Sometimes the king would need to claim the sanction of divinity, and therefore a palace and a mosque might sit together, or a palace and a church might sit together. But there was always a sort of singular center. Now this began to unravel in the 15th century, and is a process that started in Europe but spread across the world, because by that time, by dominating technologies of oceanic navigation and gunpowder, Europe had become a hegemonic world power and had started a process of colonizing large sections of the globe. Now, oceanic navigation was a real stimulus to trade, and it increased trade volumes, and that created a new breed of wealthy traders and businessmen who, because of their wealth, acquired a status which could begin to challenge the existing sources of power. This had not happened earlier. The other thing is that this had created the beginning of modern science, and that democratized and secularized knowledge. Earlier, whatever was considered proper knowledge needed either divine or royal sanction. And then the church in Europe was challenged by the Protestant Reformation because during medieval times, the church had lent political stability to Europe in the Dark Ages and had begun to misuse this power and had become corrupt. And the Protestant Reformation challenged that. So the hegemony of the church was under threat. All this led to power and knowledge becoming diffused, democratic, and secular. So how can urban design respond to this condition when earlier it had responded by the single-centered city with a dominant monument or set of monuments? This was a challenge, and it sort of evolved, and this evolution was captured by a set of maps of Rome produced by Gian Battista Noli in 1748. And what he does here is that he shows the private realm in figure ground silhouette. So the role of the private realm, it can remain private, but it contributes a facade that makes the open space public realm coherent. And within that coherence, the monuments are shown in full plan detail. So the fact that the internal detail of the monuments are white, the public spaces are white, the institutions, the public institutions are seen as part of the public realm. And so there is a distribution in space within this coherent urban pattern, and this distribution depicts the social order of the city. So this was the first map that it didn't introduce the concept, but depicted with clarity the idea of a multi-centered secular city, or how that idea could be realized. Now, this map captured some other things that were happening at the time. The Renaissance had discovered the laws of perspective, and architects began to employ those laws of perspective, the idea of the vanishing point, to emphasize what they wanted to convey. And when the Reformation challenged the church and there were competing factions of the church, there's a sort of rhetorical desire to provide emphasis on the main churches, the main religious sites. So what started to happen was there was this creation of these roads carved through the city, which focused on these major religious sites. And this was started in the early 17th century by Pope Leo X, who carved these roads and created one set of symmetrical pattern of 3 roads focusing on the Piazza del Popolo. And this is what is portrayed in the Noli map here. And it actually focuses on a gate, which is called the Porto di Popolo, which means the gate of the people. So this idea of a road focusing on a monument of significance and bringing additional significance to the emphasis to the distribution of public institutions and space was something that had begun to emerge. So this is just an aerial view. Those are the 3 roads you see. And later on, Pope Sixtus V in the second half of the 17th century started also constructing these obelisks at these major junctions to emphasize them further. So there was an idea of a grand street focusing on something of significance. Now this went through another change that was initiated by the Protestant Reformation, which argued that the church had become a corrupting influence, civilization had become a corrupting influence, and it was necessary to go back to humanity's original state before that corrupting influence had its way. So the Bible, which had so far been printed mainly only in Latin, was translated into common languages. And there's this notion of the Garden of Eden as a symbol of that original happy state. So this notion of nature representing this original state started to come in, and landscape design became a huge component in urban design. And these street axes that focused on monuments evolved into boulevards, which means large, wide, tree-lined avenues. Parks and gardens were introduced into the city, and this whole notion of projecting nature in the city became important. So this was reflected in garden design, and these roads that were drawing emphasis to focus elements where sometimes, you know, the emphasis was created on them by making them contradictory to the regular orthogonal order of the city. So they would be placed at a diagonal. And it also influenced plans like this, the design for the new city of Washington, DC as the capital of the United States, designed by French engineer Pierre Lafont. This was done in 1791. Now, one of the grand urban axes, the first that set a precedent, was the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris. And this had emerged by the mid to late 18th century as a fashionable avenue that grew from the Louvre, which is currently a museum, but was originally a palace, a set of gardens in front. And this axis had grown as a tree-lined boulevard, and it was quite established. But there was a intervention in Paris in the mid-19th century, commissioned by Napoleon III and designed by Baron Haussmann, who carved a set of boulevards into the heart of medieval Paris. And this had two functions. One was to create this emphasis on monuments, which had become this established aspect of urban design. But it also was to make the movement of troops through the city for stronger control easier. And this is the Champs-Élysées. And what Haussmann created was a major junction at the other end, at the west end of Champs-Élysées, with a whole set of radiating roads, and that had not existed before. So that's a view of the Champs-Élysées. And if you look at what had happened, you had the emergence of the Grand Avenue, which had happened earlier, coming from the Louvre and the gardens. But at the other end, in the late 19th century, a triumphal arch as a military monument to commemorate the people who had died in the French Revolution wars and the Napoleonic Wars was constructed at this junction created by Haussmann. So the idea of this bracketing of this grand boulevard with two edifices, at one end a palace or something that symbolizes governance, and at the other end a monument that arouses patriotic sentiment, was created. This set the precedent of the grand urban axis, bracketed by these two kind of nationalist fervor edifices. And this was what dominated the making of capital cities from the late 19th century onwards until the ideals of the modern movement took over in the mid 20th century. The impact of the Athens Charter in the mid 30s, it started to prevail, and things changed. But the period we are going to look at here is the period in the first half of the 20th century. And to do the comparison, I'm going to look at three grand urban axes in capital cities. The first is an axis that was never built. It was Hitler's plan to remake Berlin as Germania, which would be the grand capital of the Nazi Empire, and which would be a 7.5 kilometer long axis that would connect two new train stations. But the core of the axis was this stretch here from a triumphal arch to this domed structure. The second is the National Mall in Washington, DC, particularly the way it was remade in the early 20th century. And the third is Central Vista, which was designed around 1913-14. So we look at these three axes. And the interesting thing is they come from radically different political regimes. Central Vista was originally an imperial project. National Mall was constructed under a democratic regime. and the Boulevard of Splendor springs from a fascist regime. Now, how is it the same urban type can be deployed for such different political ends? And this is not in the nature of the type itself as a grand boulevard with focal elements, but how the constituents of that type are assembled and how they relate to each other. So for this analysis, we look at three aspects of the grand urban axis: what the focal elements are, what the edges are, and what the center of the axis is. So starting with the Boulevard of Splendors in Berlin. And that's the plan. And this project was never realized because it had to be put in suspension at the start of the war, and then Germany's defeat in the war ensured that the project never saw the light of day. The only part of the project was realized was the upgrading of Charlottenburger Strasse into a grand avenue that terminated at a historical gate to the city, the Brandenburg Gate. And this street still exists in its upgraded form. But the rest of the project was never happened. So let's look at the focal elements. At the north end, and I'm going to look first at this core part of the axis, was this domed structure called the Volkshall, the People's Hall. And you don't realize the scale of it from this plan, but it was a massive structure, and the dome contained a space which was large enough to host an audience of 180,000 people. The tip of the dome would have been 300 meters above the ground. It would have enclosed a volume that is 16 times that of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And if it had been built, it would still have been the largest single volume institution in the world. The foreground for the dome, for the Volkshall, is a huge square which was called the Great Square, which actually bridges over the Spree River. And there's a series of buildings that encircle this, the primary one being Hitler's Chancellery, and then the flanking buildings that flank either side of the entrance to the Great Square are the Wehrmacht, the Unified Armed Forces headquarters. And there was an earlier parliament building, the Reichstag, which is incorporated into this. There's a garden immediately in front, and that's also an interesting gesture. Actually, the garden was there on the eastern side, but it was extended across. And this garden also still exists. And in a way, there's a distancing between the source of authority and the rest of the axis, which sort of indicates that the authority is almost divine, is like one step above, away from the rest of society. At the other end follows the Champs-Élysées precedent, the Triumphal Arches Military Memorial, but again here at a much grander scale. This arch was over 100 meters high, and if it was possible to take the Arc de Triomphe from the Champs-Élysées and move it easily, you could pass it through this arch with plenty of clearance all around. The axis extends beyond on either side. On this side of the arch is a plaza of war victories designed to display large armaments captured during conquest. And then there is the South Station here. On the north, between the North Station and the Volkshall, is a great pool, a huge, massive reflecting pool. So people exiting North Station from this side could get a sort of double emphasis of the Volkshall, seeing both the actual structure and its reflection. And on this side is the City Hall. Now, if you look at the edges, it is constituted completely by government buildings. The core part of the axis is ministerial offices. And even these other buildings are all either buildings of government or of the military. The only public institution is the tourism center. And even that is, you can say, is a government entity, because propaganda through tourism was a key part of the Nazi machine. And, and this would sort of inculcate people in the grandeur of the space. And the location of the tourism center in front of the Soldiers' Memorial is significant. If I look at the center, it is this boulevard, which is actually pedestrianized. Traffic is diverted into an underground tunnel. And the military parades with a synchronized rhythm of jackbooted soldiers marching, that spectacle was a key part of of Nazi propaganda. So this is basically what this was designed for. So even traffic was kept out of it. So you could really capture this in all of its splendor. As I said, the project was never built, but detailed plans and models were done and inspected and approved by Hitler. And this gentleman here is Albert Speer, who was the architect who designed all of Hitler's major projects. And the model of the Boulevard of Splendors has been recreated and is on permanent exhibition in Berlin. And this is a view from above South Station. That's South Station. This is the Plaza of War Victories, and you see a model of the armaments captured. That's the Triumphal Arch, which I said was over 100 meters high. That's the main boulevard itself, surrounded by ministerial buildings, and you see the Vauxhall as the emphasis towards the rear. And you can see from this rendering the extent to which the Triumphal Arch and the Vauxhall are designed to tower above the surroundings. That's looking at this is the Great Square, and you see the size of this Vauxhall. That's the Wehrmacht headquarters on either side. This is Hitler's Chancery. That's the Reichstag building. This is the Great Pool, North Station, and that's the City Hall. This is the tourism center with a monument of soldiers in front of it. And actually this spot is significant because if you look to this side, you'll see the boulevard focusing towards the Triumphal Arch. And if you come out and you look to this side, you're very close to the entrance to the Great Square and towards the Vauxhall. So you can imagine the grandeur of this thing, the immense scale, and the fact that it is completely lined by the buildings of state, of government. So clearly the intention here is to construct the spectacle of the state at a scale where the ordinary citizen is struck mute with awe looking at the grandeur of this. And the fact that they're struck mute with awe is something that they can take pride in, that they are citizens of that state. So it's a sort of curious phenomenon of making the person proud but mute at the same time. So let's come to the National Mall in Washington, DC. And an idea of the mall was part of the original plan, but it was fundamentally reshaped. And it was one of the boulevards slightly above the others, but it wasn't bracketed. It just went into the river as a focus. And the idea of it being bracketed as a grand urban axis came only later. And this came from a plan released in 1902 by the Macmillan Commission, officially called this Report of the Senate Park Commission, etc. And the Macmillan Commission was chaired by Senator James Macmillan, but he pulled in a sort of who's who of architecture, design, and art. He had Daniel Burnham and Charles McKim of the firm McKim, Mead and White, who were the preeminent architects of the US. Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a preeminent landscape architect, famous for having designed Central Park in New York City. A highly reputed sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens. And Charles Moore, who was Senator Macmillan's chief of staff, became the secretary to the commission. Now, it followed a methodology prior to ratification of the project. It wasn't treated as a project to be implemented till first there were consultations on visions, and this process started in early 1901. And the vision was not just about the project, but also on the ideals of democracy it was meant to represent. There were suggestions received from the American Institute of Architects, and many of these were actually incorporated in the final scheme. Then they benchmarked the projects by traveling to Europe for about 6 or 7 weeks to study grand urban spaces, gardens, and manor houses there to see how they could create a space that fitted the dignity of the nation that it was meant to represent. After they came up with the proposals, there was a public exhibition open to everyone with two huge models, one which compared the current condition and one of what it would look like after the design was implemented. And the project was debated in Congress and Senate. And only after this, it was ratified as a project. So this is the plan. And if I look at focal elements, the focal element towards the east is the Capitol building, the legislature of the United States, which contains the houses of Congress and Senate. And it is interesting to note that the focus is on the legislature and executive authority is displaced to one side. The White House, which is the office and residence of the president, is on the mall, but is displaced off the axis. And the focus is on the legislature. Beyond the Capitol building is another plaza, and closing off the east edge of that plaza are the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress. So one could say that the mall towards the east focuses on the triumvirate of legislative debate, justice, and knowledge. On the western end, the focus is not a military memorial. It's a pavilion that commemorates Abraham Lincoln for having steered the nation through one of its most difficult passages in history, the American Civil War, where he managed to preserve the integrity of the Union of States while managing to abolish slavery, which was not an easy task at all. Now let's get to the edges. At this section, all these buildings marked in yellow are all public institutions and containing art galleries plus some of the great museums of the world, the Smithsonian and many others. And this was actually a very deliberate gesture. And there was a setback rule saying that no federal office building could come within 300 feet of the mall. And all of the federal office buildings are pushed beyond the 300 feet setback. And the idea for this is that as a democracy, it is the people who must be foregrounded and the government who are in the background. Whereas, so that is why the buildings need to be set back. Now, this did not come very easily. There was a huge fight about it. The Department of Agriculture claimed that it needed the space and it must occupy all the space up to the edge of the mall. The Macmillan Commission said no. Then when they prohibited it, the Department of Agriculture said, then we want to go higher to meet our space requirement. And again, the Macmillan Commission said no, because they had enforced a height limit for all the federal office buildings. So the primacy of the public institutions lining the mall would be maintained. There was a fight. The Department of Agriculture had supporters in Congress. The fight went all the way up to President Theodore Roosevelt, who finally supported what the government was aiming to achieve. And eventually the agriculture building was maintained, respected the 300-foot setback, and was part of it was taken below ground so that it could be built within the height limit. Now, the center is not a road for military parades, as has been the case in other grand urban axes. It is a park. And it's not even a park that belongs to the city. It's a designated national park and comes under the park services. It's called the National Mall and Memorial Parks. And this park, to understand the importance of this park, one must look at what Jane Jacobs has written about parks. And she contests the old adage that the park is the lung of the city. She says the lungs of the city are the sort of 1 mile of atmosphere above the city. And it's not that parks breathe life into the city, it's actually the city that breathes life into parks. And she does a study of parks in New York City to show that where the park is surrounded by uses whose patterns change across the day, and there are continuously people going in and out of them, the park is lively. where it's surrounded by office buildings, where most people are indoors during the day, they desert the buildings outside working hours, then the park is not lively. If it's used at all, it's used during good weather, during lunchtime. But eventually it starts to decay and gets captured by crime and other forces of decadence. So you have to think about how you breathe life into a park. And while Jacobs wrote this much later, it was obviously a principle the Macmillan Commission recognized, because they surrounded the park with public buildings where there's a continuous movement of people in and out, including especially on weekends. So that breathes life, and this is a vibrant space throughout the year. But on special occasions, it becomes something else, because it is, the park has 3 segments, and this easternmost segment is called the Great Lawn. And this becomes a site of popular public protest, and that still happens today. And there have been many public protests, but perhaps one of the most significant was the Great March in Washington in 1963 to fight racism, where Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech calling for the end of racism. And this is an event that was significant enough that it's believed to have played a role in the eventual passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So it's an epoch-making space. The park has 3 segments. The middle segment is a tall obelisk, the Washington Monument, commemorating the US's first president. And towards the west, fronting the river, are 2 large water bodies, a reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial and a large tidal basin. Surrounding the tidal basin are Washington's famous cherry trees, where a lot of people travel to see the blossoms during spring. And these 2 water bodies all around are surrounded by a series of sites of public memory. Memorials such as the Vietnam War Memorial, the Korean War Memorial, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and many more. So some views: this is the Lincoln Memorial, which forms the western termination of the National Mall. This is standing at one edge of the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial, looking at, this is the Washington Monument, and you see the Capitol building in the distance. This is the Great Lawn looking towards the Capitol building. And these are some of the public memorials. This is the Vietnam War Memorial, this Martin Luther King Memorial, the Korean War Memorial, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial. And you see how these landscapes become a site of public memory. And these memorials also attract visitors all through the year. So the western end of the park is also lively. So now we come to Central Vista. And what I'll do is I'll look at this in 3 segments. I'll first look at the original imperial plan, then I'll look at the current condition, and then I'll come to the proposed redevelopment. So if you see the original imperial plan, it has a lot of the ideals that were prevalent in urban design, the grand urban axis, that is Central Vista, plus the other diagonal roads as boulevards. So getting into the original imperial plan and its focal elements. At the western end, the focus is on executive authority, the Viceroy's house and the Viceroy's estate behind it. The estate is not a public space, it's walled off, but the house is a focal element, and that's part of the public experience. It is foregrounded by the arms of the executive. So it's literally like this is the head, these are the 2 arms, and there's a representation of government as a whole. So these 2 north and south block form the ministries. And then there's a plaza which was officially called Prince Edward Place, but would often be referred to as the Great Place. Council House, which is the legislature, lies here. And now you see why this is an imperial project, whereas National Mall is a democratic project, because National Mall focused on the legislature and displaced the executive to one side. Here, there's a focus on the executive and a displacement of the legislature to one side. At the east end, again, the Champs-Élysées model, a triumphal arch as military monument, the All India War Memorial, which is to commemorate Indian forces who died during World War I. There's a hexagonal park around the War Memorial, which is uh, the heads of the princely states were offered plots surrounding this, so it came to be known as a Prince's Park. So it was a gesture to win their support. The War Memorial is actually displaced from the center of the hexagon, and the hexagon center is a cupola that houses a statue of King George V. Some of the princely buildings are constructed as part of the original project. Hyderabad House is designed by Lutyens, completed in 1926. Jaipur House, designed by Arthur Bloomfield, completed in 1932. Now let's come to the edges. And firstly, there's a landscape lining the edges, lawns of the central vista with these long reflecting pools within them and trees lining them. But a key part is this central intersection, which this road was called the King's Way and this road was called the Queen's Way. And these four buildings were to be a culture hub. There was the Imperial Record Office, the Ethnological Museum, Antiquities Museum, and the Imperial Library. And the center was supposed to be a processional boulevard where authority would sort of march down in procession. And there were a lot of articles in the British press about glorifying this and saying how it was wonderful that the spectacle of empire, the spectacle of the viceroy coming down in his carriage, going towards his house, and people could watch him. And so this notion of military parades, of processional spectacle was a strong part of the axis. These are the four buildings of the cultural hub. This is a perspective that was drawn of an early version of the scheme. There were varying versions of the plan of what would come in these other buildings, but one thing is consistent in all the plans. One is that they are further set back from the main vista compared to the culture hub. They are lower in height. They're more disaggregated in form, broken up, and they're entered from the parallel roads on either side. So they're meant not to have a strong presence on the vista. So the vista itself is meant to be this public landscape and this culture hub. This is an early plan. There was a proposal at that time to construct a cathedral with a circular arcade around it, which would mimic the which would provide the symmetrical balance to Parliament House. But that plan was dropped later. There were also plans that these buildings, and that proposal appears in more versions than this one does, that these would be residences for senior members of government. So these buildings coming here would be even smaller and more broken up. While this is a later photograph, I think what it captures in its focus captures the spirit of the imperial plan. The cupola, the triumphal arch, the Viceroy's house, north and south block on either side, the main lawns of the vista and the water bodies and the trees on either side of the water body. Now, in its structure, the imperial plan sits somewhere between the National Mall and the Boulevard of Splendors. In terms of its focal elements, it represents the Boulevard of Splendors, although not at that megalomaniacal scale. But it has executive authority and military memory as the focal elements. But in its center and in its edges, really, it is more the National Mall because it sees the central part, the main core of the vista as a public landscape with public cultural institutions. Now, this might have come out of British arrogance because they viewed the colonization of India as a civilizing mission. And that might very well be true, but the point is that at independence, we inherited an urban space that had it as its core public landscape and public culture. That was the concept. So what's the current condition? So the development since independence has been rather haphazard, and the original symmetry and neatness of the vista is lost to a certain extent. The boating is allowed in the pools of the vista, and it gets renamed as the Boat Club Lawns. I don't know if it's ever been officially named that, but it's colloquially known as that. This plaza gets renamed as Vijay Chowk, and I'll explain later perhaps why that name was chosen. The Viceroy's house becomes Rashtrapati Bhavan, the house of the president. North and South Block remain as the Secretariat. The Council House becomes Sansad Bhavan, is House of India's Parliament. The King's Way gets named Rajpath, and the Queen's Way gets renamed as Janpath, the Way of the People. The All India War Memorial gets renamed as India Gate and now houses the Amar Jawan Jyoti, the flame commemorating the immortal soldier. The statue of King George is removed from the cupola. At one time, there's a proposal to put Mahatma Gandhi's statue there, but eventually the decision is taken to just leave it empty as a mnemonic symbol that the British Raj was once here, but was made to leave. Some of the buildings around the Princess Park get appropriated in different manners. Hyderabad House gets taken over by the government and becomes a space for hosting and entertaining foreign dignitaries. Jaipur House gets taken over and extended as the National Gallery of Modern Art. Other thing, Patiala House is taken over as a courthouse. But where structures have not been built, a series of ad hoc constructions, various bureaucratic buildings. One site gets taken over for army housing, and they come up around the hexagon. Dhyan Chand Stadium is built towards the eastern end, and in the Lutyens' plan, there was a proposal that the vista would be extended all the way east till it reached the Yamuna River. So now to do that visually becomes, is no longer possible because of the large stadium there. More recently, a large part of the hexagon is the military memory steps in even more, and the National War Memorial is made. Also, as needs increase, a series of ministerial offices are constructed over here in buildings that range in height from, most of them are 5 or 6 floors and a couple of them are 7 floors. What happens to the culture hub? The National Archives was the Imperial Record Office, which was originally built. It is preserved and renamed as the National Archives, extended slightly in a not very sensitive edition. The Antiquities Museum becomes the National Museum, but that comes only in 1960. So the cultural hub is getting preserved, but very slowly and not very, in a rather ad hoc manner. The Ethnological Museum never happens. And this entire site is given over in the 1980s to the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. An international design competition is held to design this. It is won by an American architect, Ralph Lerner. And it's only partially one segment of it is built and a couple of other temporary structures. So it's never a project that's never been realized, but the plot has always been under the IGNCA. Eventually, the culture hub gets compromised with government offices taking over. And this is something very recent. This building housing the Ministry of External Affairs was occupied only in the end of 2012. So it's less than 8 years old as a functioning building. And now the idea of the culture hub starts getting compromised. Other structures come up. Vigyan Bhavan, an auditorium, which is the conference center for government functions. And some notion of the original Lutyens' plan of putting, one of the Lutyens' proposals of putting residences for senior functionaries is implemented, and the vice president's house is located here. Other random constructions start taking place. A series of hutments are built on these 2 triangular plots, and various staff from the defense services are located here. There are further sort of ad hoc structures built within the president's estate, which house the president's staff quarters and also some more defense staff. And there are many more for the president's staff quarters, which are built within the estate, which are not shown on this plan. A park which was supposed to be the foreground to the to Parliament House is appropriated, although it's never redesignated as not being a park. And it takes open parking for Parliament, the security barracks that serve Parliament, etc. Coming back to this view, you see some of the original intent. This is one of the later office buildings, the tallest one of them, which is 7 floors. The others are much lower, but you see that they are further set back. It's only the culture buildings which are supposed to protrude. That's the National Museum building, and that is the National Archives. Now, a lot of people have argued this was a colonial construction. Why should we respect it? But the fact is, it was appropriated by Indians, and this appropriation was spontaneous and immediate. This is a scene from 15th August 1947, the first day of independent India. And people just gathered here to celebrate the fact that India was now an independent nation. And I suspect this is the reason why this plaza was renamed Vijay Chowk. Significant events have happened here. The debates of the Constituent Assembly, the birth of India's constitution, is associated with the House of Parliament. There have been major moments in history. This is a meeting between Dr. Ambedkar and Rajendra Prasad, our first president. Every single debate of Parliament since independence has happened here. So there's a lot of history woven into the place. We celebrate the space on 26 January, and it's not just a military parade, it's also a cultural parade. And actually some British rituals have also been appropriated. The beating of the retreat on 29 January is still very popular and people come here. And although it's a ritual that dates back to colonial times, no one in the audience watching it thinks they're watching a British army. Everyone says they're watching an Indian army and its bands. We light up and celebrate the place on Independence Day and Republic Day. The boat club lawns have been a site of popular protest. Although there is a move in recent years, probably the last 10 years or so, to try and move protest away from here, citing security. But it still is a site for protest. People seek to assemble there. This is Chaudhry Charan Singh addressing a rally of farmers that is about 3 lakh people strong in 1978. 10 years later, you have Mahendra Singh Tikait addressing an even larger audience of about 5 lakh farmers. More recently, the protests against the Nirbhaya rape case, this is 2012, take place here. When it's not a site of protest, it is a popular everyday landscape. Kids play here. The boat club, a celebration of New Year's at India Gate. It's a gathering space where people come, they take selfies. There's a children's park which has been created within the hexagon, and for many people who have grown up in Delhi, a strong part of their memory is coming here, having ice cream, buying balloons from the street vendors who have come up around there. More recently, this is International Yoga Day. This is about 3 or 4 years ago. And I think this appropriation of the fact was made easier by the architecture of the place, where Lutyens and Baker did not stay within an orthodox European classicism and adopted many Indian elements. So these buildings have chhatris and jharokas and chhajjas, and they use red sandstone as a material and domes. So there was a sort of a localized kind of language that did have some kind of a presence here, and that made the appropriation easier. Which is why the 70 years of history in this space has led to the Heritage Conservation Committee of Delhi, with a statutory authority to protect heritage, declaring it as a heritage zone, not just as a heritage zone, but a grade 1 heritage zone, which means you can't change it. You're not supposed to be able to change it easily. And it's not just each of the monuments is not only individually listed in this, but even the precinct as a whole is listed. So obviously what is seen worthy of protection is not just the monuments, but also their configuration and how they come together to make the precinct. So let's look at the proposed redevelopment, and that's what it looks like. And many of the elements from the existing condition are retained. So what has come in? One is that Parliament will no longer be, the old circular building will no longer be where the Houses of Parliament meet. There will be a new triangular Parliament building in that plot in front of it, and this will become an extension of that. A series of 10 donut-shaped, 7-story high office buildings housing all the ministries in a central secretariat are constructed. Since Vigyan Bhavan is demolished, that's upgraded, and a new National Conference Center is created here. This plot is taken over, and the Prime Minister's office, which hitherto had been in South Block, has its own construction over here. Since the Vice President's house is displaced from here, these hutments in this plot are removed and the Vice President's house is put here. And although that was not part of the original brief, there is now the proposal to relocate the Prime Minister's residence to here. The Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, which used to be here, is removed from the main vista and is put off the vista in one of the plots facing the India Gate hexagon. That's a view of the proposal. These are all those 7-story buildings that you see. And please take note of the way they form an almost continuous wall of construction over here, which had not existed before. So you get that here, you get that here, you get a bit of it here. Some of this is slightly lower height, but on this side, it's almost continuously 7 floors, whereas the earlier buildings were largely 5 to 6 floors with 1 or 2 of them as 7 floors. This is just looking at the same section of it in plan. So you see that's the National Museum, that's the National Archives. Other buildings are more setback, except for the violation that happened in 2012 with the External Affairs Ministry. This section of the vista, all of it is low-rise. That's the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, that's Vigyan Bhavan, this is the Vice President's house. But it's no longer low-rise now, it is surrounded by 7-story buildings. In one of the presentations of the architects, and I should mention that nothing in this is in the public domain. Whatever I'm showing you is gleaned from screenshots made by certain presentations by the architect to fairly restricted audiences. So in one of the presentations, it was argued that although these 7-story buildings are coming up on either side, you won't see them because the tree line, if you're looking above the top of the trees will still define the horizon. However, this portrayal is just shown from a single viewpoint, which is the center of Rajpath. And actually the perception, which is perhaps more important, is how these lawns are experienced, where you're able to look between the trunk of trees. And the earlier condition where there were a lot of gaps between the buildings, and now the gaps are largely reduced. So definitely from the lawns on either side, you will sense this wall of construction. One of the questions is the extent of area that is being produced. If you just look at the plans, it looks like there is you just visually compare the plans at the same scale. It looks like, on the left is the existing condition, on the right is the proposed development. It looks like there's a huge increase in the quantum of area. But in the same presentation I was referring to, which the architect made, he claimed that the increase in the working population of Central Vista is only 2%, going up from 50,000 to 51,000. And that's because all these hutments were some 10,000 defense staff are located, 9,000 defense staff are being moved out of Central Vista, and 10,000 government employees who are outside Central Vista are being brought in. So it's only 2%. But the built up area looks substantially more than a 2% increase. And this has not been explained. No area statements in the public domain, so we don't know what is happening. One is you can see that much more ground footprint is occupied by these buildings. A low-rise section of the vista is not low-rise anymore. And the average height of all these buildings is higher than the average height of the existing ministerial buildings. This is a view of the new triangular building. And one of the rules of grade 1 heritage preservation is that you can't put any structure that will diminish the visual importance of an existing grade 1 building, which probably will not happen here because this building is grade 1 heritage, and because it's circular, as the circular form recedes in perspective, its apparent bulk is reduced. Whereas if you put up a uniform height building that fronts this, then this will start dominating perception, and this will not. So there has been a proposal by the architect, which there's some contradictions here, so we don't know what the true picture is. In some of the presentations by the architect, very early, they said that the existing parliament building will become a museum of democracy. But in more recent presentations, the statement has been made that the National Archives building will be preserved in its current usage as a National Archives. That North and South blocks, since the Secretariat will move into these new buildings, will be converted into the National Museum, which has been displaced from this site. And that an arboretum has been created here as a public space, biodiversity park, which will put back some of the public space that has been lost in the vista. Although this space was entered from Mother Teresa Crescent, which is from the west of Rashtrapati Bhavan, so does not form part of the spatial experience. So it really doesn't balance public space removed. Now this is contradicted by, these are statements made by the architect, which are not backed by any statements by the government. In an interview, the architect was asked about this, and he just rather ambiguously replied that, well, I've made these proposals in many presentations to government and nobody has contradicted me. But there are pronouncements that seem to contradict these. One, the Museum of Democracy is definitely not happening, and even the architect has stopped talking about that. And in the legal submission for approval for this new parliament building, it is clearly stated that this will act as an extension of parliament. In fact, this new building is, there's an attempt to portray it as an extension of an existing building rather than a new project. But the other thing is that land use notifications to implement this project have been notified and gazetted. And these contradict these claims by the architect. So for example, this is the plot of the National Archives, which is currently zoned public, semi-public. And in the new land use, it is government office. This is the zoning of North and South blocks, which is high security government office. And it is still preserved as high security government office in the change of land use. And these plans actually don't show the site for the arboretum, but if you look at the change of land use, there is no proposal to create a public space here. So in the evaluation right now, one has to give greater weight to legal pronouncements of government over remarks made by a private individual in informal settings. So one cannot take those proposals into account. So what does the redevelopment portend? Let's conclude with that. And what you see, if you look at the current condition, there was a choice in the original imperial plan, which was to preserve the center as a public landscape. So we could have gone more towards that, which would have been something that is more in empathy with the National Mall in Washington. However, we have chosen to displace all public institutions from the space, make it completely a space of government, make the visual spectacle of government dominant in the space. And so we seem to have made a choice to move more towards the Boulevard of Splendors, uh, the German example from the Nazi era. I'm not saying it is a fascist turn, but it is definitely a more authoritarian turn. Or it seems to be a more authoritarian turn just looking at the design. To validate whether it is such a turn, we also have to look at the project process. And here again, let's just revisit the benchmark that the National Mall set. One was consultations on democracy and architectural ideas before starting design, benchmarking with the best in the world, best practices in the world, putting everything in the public domain for comment before ratifying it as a project, and debating it in the legislature, and doing all this prior to ratifying the project. But here we have some procedural gaps which seem quite profound. There has been no public discussion or any discussion that we know of on what vision of democracy this project should represent. And really that vision should have formed a strong part of the architectural design brief, whereas actually the architects were just told, you interpret it. And they were given 3 weeks to submit their proposal. So that was the time given to articulate the future legacy of democracy in India. This project, which completely reshapes the spaces of parliament, has had no parliamentary debate, no parliamentary sanction for the project, no discussion on what the project should do. It is typical for projects involving parliament to be subjected to the oversight of a joint parliamentary committee. There have been 2 earlier joint parliamentary committees which were constituted to oversee all projects of parliament. The last one was sort of disbanded. It's never met after the 2019 election. Everything is done secretly. The plan is not put in the public domain. The public cannot scrutinize it. There have been no public hearing or consultations in the true sense of the word. Whatever has come out into the, in a limited way, have been presentations by the architect to architectural audiences. Whereas actually it should be presentations by the government to a general citizenry, because there's much more at stake here than just the architecture. It's a grade 1 heritage precinct with several grade 1 heritage monuments. Typically there's a heritage audit which analyzes this, sees what needs refurbishment, but also identifies what is worthwhile and must be preserved. And any design must take such a rigorous audit into account. That's an established good practice in heritage conservation, but nothing on this is we don't know that if this has been done, and if it has been done, it's not been disclosed. There is no analysis of needs. For example, the claim that we need a new parliament building is because our population has grown. So therefore, to keep the proportion of electoral representation constant, we need larger houses of parliament. And it is said that the old building can't accommodate that. Firstly, there's been no analysis of these things, no numbers put up on what the demographics are expected to be. And so no one really knows. There have been some proposals put up by private architects suggesting that the numbers proposed in the new development can be met within the existing construction. There are also demographic studies which state that somewhere between 2050 and 2060, India's population will peak. The population growth will peak and then will begin to decline after that. So are we doing all this just for a need that's going to last about 30, 40 years? And despite all this, it's being moved towards making the project a fait accompli. Land use changes have been notified and gazetted. Legal submissions have been made to approve the construction of a new parliament building, statutory approvals. Construction bids for the new parliament building have been floated, and every contractor who's bidding has been asked to sign a non-disclosure secrecy agreement. So why is all this being done? What are the underlying motives? There's an extreme interpretation which says that this is a fascist turn, that Indian governance is taking. Now, you might look at the parliament, at the design of how it's increasing the spectacle of government, moving more to the Boulevard of Splendors President rather than the National Mall. You might look at all these procedural gaps and say, yeah, maybe that's right. But let's take the charitable assumption here. Let's say that whoever is doing this project is doing it with the best of intentions. They want something that will work to the glory of India. They want something that will truly serve the nation. Even if you make this assumption, that it's still problematic, and one is forced to dwell in the ringing words of Justice Khanna in his famous dissenting judgment in the ADM Jabalpur case of 1976, which was the case during the height of the emergency. And I paraphrased his words a bit here. And he said, the greatest danger to liberty lies in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but lacking due deference for the ideals of democracy and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely remarkable synthesis. That's also making such a compelling case and often made the blood boil while seeing the presentation of a proud but mute citizen. I'd really like to throw this open to the other panelists in terms of questions and concerns. And then perhaps we can take questions from the audience as well. Please type your questions in the question and answer section. Okay, perhaps I can start off with some questions.
Sure.
So one is that, you know, in terms of the hierarchy of spaces, it's kind of a radiating hierarchy from the Viceroy's house, which is radiating outward towards, you know, sprawling bungalows of senior officials, and then further on to 2- and 3-story apartments of lower officials, the race course, the golf courses, clubs, hotels, which kind of give an enduring sense of stability and permanence, which is what the British really wanted. And the ordinary people, the workers, the service staff, and all the supported staffs, and they kind of, you know, recede in the modernism of the new capital, living in densities which are really 200 times the density of these in these areas. And this privilege is availed by people who have appropriated this space really after independence without any real debate or discussion at all. So there is that pending debate and discussion, not just for the Central Vista, but also for the areas around Lutyens' Delhi. But as a question, sorry, to you, you know, is there or can there be a powerful symbolic gesture which have been the case in the case of resistance, both non-violent and violent, but a more kind of a gesture which is more sustained? And what would be the examples of that in your mind, where it's the representational space is not founded in spectacle, but in relationships of people, between people, the environment, and cultural artifacts of people?
Yeah, I've only looked at Central Vista in my analysis. I haven't really looked at the entire Lutyens Baker zone, but I think what you say is really there. And I'd just like to mention one thing that I made in an earlier talk I gave some months ago, citing George Orwell's famous novel, Animal House. And in that, the animals revolt and drive the oppressive farmers out of the farm. And it's supposed to become an equal society driven by the slogan, all animals are equal. And then gradually the pigs sort of become more powerful in that, and they start becoming the sort of new sort of government of this farm. And the old slogan is reworked to read, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." And the novel ends with the pigs inviting the farmers back to the farm for a discussion, the original human farmers. And they are in the farmhouse having a discussion, and the other animals can't hear what is being said. And they're looking in through the windows, and the closing line of the novel is, it said they looked from pig to human and human to pig and realized they couldn't tell the difference. So I think in a lot of ways our appropriation of the Latvian zone is that way. But I think you have to look at what has happened through processes that have not been officially sanctioned. The idea of political protest on the boat club lawns, the idea of the India Gate hexagon being this place you take your kids to for ice cream and balloons, and these were not all intended in the original design. The original design was pure spectacle, right? But there's been an appropriation in the way bodies move through space. And I think this is articulated most powerfully by Michel Doucette's book, The Practice of Everyday Life. And he says there are two ways of dealing with urban space. And the first, which is used by the powerful, is to structure the discussion around the idea of space, where you say that there is a certain spatial order which represents what is proper, what is meant to be. So space as spectacle is foregrounded there. The weak, realizing they have no control over space, actually use time as their tactic. So there are cleverly timed incursions into space where you move your body into space and you start doing something which starts characterizing the space, which is not part of the official plan. So that is actually what has happened in protest in the boat club lawns, in the India Gate hexagon, and playing cricket on the boat club lawns, all kinds of things. And I'm just, so I think in an urban design direction, you need to look at how you use time as a way to energize space, and not just use space as something fixed. And this is hugely important. In fact, Rahul Mehrotra makes a similar point when he talks about the static city and the kinetic city, where the kinetic city is the space of street vendors and hawkers and billboards and all kinds of things. And he says, if you look at photographs of the Indian city, you always see that the kinetic city is in the foreground and the static city is in the background. But if you look at the official discourse of planning, the kinetic city is ignored and only the static city is spoken about. So I think we have to look at, and so Jane Jacobs' argument, for example, on how parks come to life is actually, can you design in a way that you catalyze this freedom of the body to move through space? So one has to look at it from that point of view rather than just the spectacle of urbanism. And I think that's characterized a whole debate about modernity. We've had a debate we've reduced modernity to an aesthetic question, not an ethical question. It's meant to be an ethical project, but we now just look at the spectacle of modernity, the grand projects, And a lot of people have been seduced by that. There's a large segment which feel that even the Central Vista project symbolizes development. And it symbolizes the glory. And so a lot of people are very troubled that I've chosen to resist the project. I'm considered anti-national in that respect. And because we're talking about the spectacle of development. So if you look at the ethics, it's how do you empower bodies to move in the city is the key question.
Thank you for that. Riaz, do you have a question?
Yeah, Sudipta, if I can come in, because I think I wanted to ask something. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So Prem, I wanted to pick up on this, what you were talking about right now, and it seems that both in the presentation where you talk about the fact that a particular type, in this case the grand access type, um, can work in many ways, in the three ways that you outlined, but also in the way that it's appropriated by people. It seems that program is of key importance here. And the way that one actually looks at programming, reprogramming spaces is where perhaps a resistance can also lie. Do you have thoughts about this in terms of, let's say there is a fait accompli of buildings, but the potential of a future reprogramming, is this something that is enough if one was to look at it? Or is the form also something that one has to consider equally? For example, if we are talking about the strength of appropriation that we have had post-independence, can we then say that a post-redevelopment occupation might also be a possible inhabitation that could be a democratic process?
Yes and no. Yes, program can make a huge difference. For example, in the National Mall, the idea to programmatically line the Great Lawn with public institutions was a huge factor. However, you have to realize that program also has its limitations, especially when you look at it in a unified sense. The National Mall was done in a time of classicism. The notion of what is proper was still sort of dominant there. So you can look at some aspects of the of that, but you also have to recognize that the place is run in such a way. The architecture of many of these public institutions built on high plinths with grand staircases entering, the presence of security guards, things like that. Probably a poor African American would not feel welcome there. A person, the fact that it's lined with museums and galleries, which are all symbols of high culture, a person who is not highly educated would not feel welcome there. So you've got to realize there are limitations of program. That's one part of it. The second part of it is to realize that program is not deterministic, that if you put a certain program, you can't automatically assume that something will follow from that. So I think you have to look at an underlying aspect of what makes a city lively. And there are a lot of writings on this, which are too numerous to cite here, but I'll just try and summarize some of the key principles. One of them is that the city offers anonymity compared to the village, where you're always under the gaze of tradition. You can be free. You can operate out because of your anonymity. So there's a potential to be reflective. Second is the city offers a lot of opportunities to leverage that autonomy. The size of the city offers economies of scale. There are many people you can connect with. Then there are economies of density. They're close at hand, so it's easier to connect with. The economies of association that result, you can form new groups. The economies of extension, that you can use this to connect with spaces beyond the city and have economic or social interactions with that way. So you see a lot of people leveraging all these, and that is why cities are known as creative places all over the world, right? Like even in India, the urban population is less than 35%, but over 70% of GDP is produced in cities. So once you look at that, then perhaps you're not looking at the idea of a master plan as deterministic. What you really need to do is to study all the ways people are being creative in the use of cities. And planning is primarily a means of one, giving spatial coherence to these various strategies, but also removing contradictions between diverse strategies. And it's not to bring everyone under a single strategy. So it's a little more complex than just program. You really have to look carefully at how a city functions and why the city is a creative and democratic space.
I have a question. I'm going to use Sudipto's words of blood boiling, which is, I think, well phrased. And I thought that your presentation was by intent, maybe to provoke us into joining your discontent in some way about what's happening. Can you also explain us a little bit about the process that you're involved with? You said that you have communicated your discontent to them. What process was this? Or the presentations by the architect, what process was that? Or how were you involved in that?
I have been, there has actually been very little attempt, very little opportunity to engage in dialogue. In fact, there has been no opportunity to engage in dialogue. So one has put a lot of one's concerns in the public realm, saying these are questions that need to be answered. I know that one of those writings, someone wrote to me saying that he was a college classmate of the architect and he's forwarded those questions to the architect. But there has been no sort of public response to it. So one is just speaking and writing as much as one can. One is supporting whatever the matter is sub judice right now. So I can't speak of that, but one is lending some support to that process too. But otherwise, just raising the question. I'm happy to say I'm a bit uncomfortable with the blood boiling reaction, I must say, because I don't intend what I've presented to be a tool of propaganda to convince people that my opinion is right. My primary objection here is that this is a matter that is significant enough that we need a public discourse on it. And I think we should still push for that public discourse. And it's not going to be given to us. We have to form larger numbers to demand it. But really, I would like to keep the tone of, I would suggest that we avoid phrases like blood boiling, because whatever we do, we have to live by the principles we're trying to support. And a basic principle of a democracy is that we remain courteous, we remain open to other ideas, we remain open to debate. So it should not be interpreted as propaganda.
I was I was going to continue there in a way that if we have to take it a bit more positively or present it a bit more positively as a group, as the studio, how would you guide us in taking part in that larger conversation or the larger process that is going on?
I think the thing in a studio is that you can, because you have many people participating in the studio, is raise awareness that there are many ways to look at this thing, look at this issue, and perhaps we should examine all those ways. And the fact that there are so many ways means that we need a dialogue. It's an issue of democracy, and issues of democracy cannot be resolved through intellectual analysis. So a presentation by me or a few others, few writings by a few others is not going to resolve it. Issues of democracy can only be resolved through democratic processes. That's the basic principle. So the fact that we can leverage, I'm not familiar really with the specific design exercise you'll have undertaken in the studio, but if you have ideas that suggest one can look at the space differently, and definitely in a studio, you will have a multiplicity of ideas. I think it would be good to just publicly foreground that multiplicity rather than just say we have a proposal. You know, not even attempt to say this is the best proposal and that's the worst proposal or anything like that, but just say there's this multiplicity and reflect on what that multiplicity represents. And what I've sought to do in my analysis and whatever I do in evaluating architecture and urban design, I've always been highly influenced by a particular passage in the writing of Alan Colquhoun. And I think he starts an essay critiquing Michael Graves with this passage. And he says that criticism is not about judgment. And it's always suspended between sort of poetic sympathy and analysis. And it can never grasp the essence of the work that it's discussing. But what criticism does is that it seeks to get beyond the apparent visual, get beyond the visual appearance of the work and uncover its ideology. So I think that's the second thing that I would suggest you look in the studio, that you look at the schemes, not just in terms of their appearance, but in terms of what ideology they represent.
Thanks.
Can I come in?
Sure.
Thank you for this excellent presentation, which in my view is the way any kind of architectural, project could be approached. There are some serious questions. You see, I've read all your writings, and I have read, after these things have started happening, I've read about the whole issue of democracy and democratic institutions. If we, for time being, accept what is happening, and not for time being, if we accept what is happening, do you think, have you ever come across in their presentation? I have not attended any of their presentations, so I don't really know. But have you come across a serious approach to this project from the architect in terms of his own inquiries, his own ideas about this kind of institution, and developing concepts, which can really set this entire premise on an existing site? Because I fail to understand that such a proposal could become, a proposal if these processes were gone through. Because to me, it really appears like an instant proposal, which was prepared in a short period of time, which was given. The clients openly said that they have no program. They have not given any program from their side, but they have left everything to the architect to decide. So have you in your process of study of this entire, project, come across any kind of conceptual processes through which this project has emerged?
As I said earlier, since one has not had the opportunity to dialogue, I cannot speak with authority on what the architect is actually thinking. But on what is on offer, what has been disclosed, none of that background analysis has come about, and has been apparent. In one of the online discussions, which was not a presentation of the project. It was a general interview. And it was an interview by two architects I know in Bangalore, Naresh Narasimhan and Vijay Nanapati. And since I know them, I sent some questions that need to be asked. And one of the questions, I mean, only one of those questions is actually asked, which was the fact that in this change of land use, over 80 acres of land is being taken out of public use and being converted to government use. And his response to that was, this is just a clever wordplay to just make a point. It's not looking at the essence of the scheme. You're not looking at the fact that these 50 acres of arboretum is being created. And he felt it was, he dismissed it as wordplay.
Mm-hmm.
I felt compelled to then publish a response to that, since it was a response to my question, and therefore I took on some other questions that had also come up. And actually, this is my second rejoinder to Bimal Patel, who was the head of HCP, who was designing this. The first was in response to an article he published in the Landscape Journal, which was very ironically titled Democracy, Participation and Consultation. And he, okay, let me just backtrack a bit. He was sent editorial proof to approve for this. And he decided to share that proof with a few people. Although really that's against the conventional etiquette in publishing, you don't share an editorial proof. And because he shared it, that proof then leaked, and some of us got to receive it before the journal was actually being published, and it was being published as a digital journal. And so I wrote to the editor of the journal and said, look, this is a very significant project. You can't publish a piece like this without a counterpoint. She said, we're going to include counterpoint in the next issue, which they did. I must credit them with that. But I said, a counterpoint, this project is moving so fast that a counterpoint that appears in your next issue, which will come 2 or 3 months later, is too late. You got to include it with this. So please hold the journal for a week till we can send you a counterpoint. But they decided not to do that. So the counterpoint I'd written was published in a portal called Architecture Live. And in that, I raised many of, not exactly this comparison of 3 axes here, but more the process issues of how it is not meeting democratic norms, and that you can't write this and then call us, say you're talking about democracy, participation, and consultation. Then later on, when he had this interview and he responded to my question saying it is just wordplay, I felt I had to publish another rejoinder. I said that if you make these statements saying it's a democratic project without disclosing any details about then about the project, then to me that's the ultimate in wordplay. I talked about how creating this space on this arboretum is really not balancing public usage, etc. in that. But there's one other important point I wrote on in this rejoinder, which was a question that came up which never got answered. And Vijay Nanapati asked Bimal Patel about the fact that there was no real design brief for the project. And this is a point you have just mentioned, Professor. And Bimal said that, yeah, that's a strength of the project, that that we could then interpret what kind of spaces could be offered. To which Vijay responded that there is a difference between a design brief and a space program. And your response is regarding a space program. I'm talking about a design brief. And Bimal responded saying, I don't understand. What is the difference? And then there was a technical problem with Vijay's connection, so that question never got answered. And in my rejoinder, I said that the space program is actually programmatic requirements. But those programmatic requirements spring from a broader vision of what the project is meant to achieve. And that's what a design brief is. Like, what is our ideal of democracy? How do we represent it? And because the Macmillan Commission debated that in the National Mall, they came up with a conclusion that the spectacle of the mall should not be dominated by government and should be dominated by public culture. So as I said, I really don't know, and one will not know till one actually has an opportunity to dialogue. But whatever one has seen is not very encouraging. And if the difference between a design brief and a space program is not understood, then there is cause for concern.
No, this is true.
And the other thing that I have gathered from prior presentations by Bimal Patel is that he appears to be, in fact, he has explicitly said this. He's saying that we have a lot to learn from Western urban design. And he likes the clarity of lines, the sort of discipline of lines of space in Western urban design. And that is what he has been seeking to implement. And I think besides Central Vista, you see this quest in his other projects like the Sabarmati Riverfront or the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, to bring this discipline on the city. And in fact, let me narrate an incident to sort of illustrate the point. I heard a lecture when I gone to a conference in the UK many years ago. And it was by a Dutch installation artist. And he was bothered by this rigidity of space in the Dutch city, that if you draw a line, you say only this happens on this side and only that happens on that side. So his installations were all about attempts to blur those lines. So, he had like one where a lawn spills out onto the road, and, it was quite interesting. But I found it interesting, but also very alien, because to me, in an Indian city, you can't draw a line and say that it is a rigid boundary and this happens on this side and that happens on that side. And there's so many sort of ambiguous kind of gaps which are sort of used in all kinds of ways. Like you project a plinth by 45 centimeters and someone will run a shop in that projection out of that space. So the blurring of lines, to me, this notion of the kinetic city being in the foreground, to me is emblematic of the Indian urban condition. One has to see how, that it seems to be the inherent creative spirit. And one has to see how one can channelize that, because we don't even recognize it. It happens in sort of very obstructive ways. But we have to see how we channelize that energy. In fact, there's one interesting, I was talking earlier about how the creative interactions between people who sort of leverage their anonymity in the city leads to a lot of the energy in the city. And there's a wonderful formulation by a sociologist called Robert Park from the University of Chicago. And he wrote this, I think, in 1916, over 100 years ago. And he said the role of the city is to foreground the moral range of deviant behavior. And I think that's just, I'm really enamored by that phrase. I think that it's really wonderful. But there's this the official paradigm of Indian urban planning is to enforce discipline and not permit deviance. And there is this notion that there is a fear that a large section of the population is uncivilized and uneducated and pre-modern, and therefore you have to enforce modernity by creating this discipline. What is not realized is, one is the extent of the city that is marginalized in this process.
Mm.
In all our cities, more than half the urban population lives outside the paradigm of official urbanism.
Mm.
They live in slums, they live on pavements, they live in unregulated layouts and spaces like that. And they operate in those kind. That is a majority, but that's not the city that official urbanism recognizes. So there is this constant quest to discipline the city, to draw from Western urbanism and impose these disciplining lines. Now, what we don't realize is, I mean, there are a lot of problems with this. One is it creates spatial discontinuities that obstruct inefficient urban services. So we all get affected by that. You know, losses in power and water systems in Indian cities run in the range of 35 to 40%, which is mind-boggling, but that's been continuing for many years. And that's because you can't lay an efficient space service network when you have this discontinuity in space, because half the population isn't recognized. And then that population is forced to unofficially tap into the system or to politically negotiate their way into the system through slum lords or whatever. But the other thing, and this is what I'm really worried about, because this is going to be India's urban century. For the first time, you'll be a majority urban population. And by the middle of the century. And how we imagine cities will determine whether we sink or swim as a country.
Mm.
And we have created a condition where there's so many people who are unrecognized in the space of the city that they feel that the only way they can assert their presence is through violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the first step. And second is, this claim for assertion is being mobilized by politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we don't recognize this as we urbanize further, that contestation, those signs of violence we are already seeing is going to get even worse. So it is an extremely worrying situation that we need to pay serious heed to.
Mm-hmm.
So I wandered quite far off from your original question. I'm sorry.
No. This is something, because I think it is extremely important, because, you were also asked about the studio. But looking at this entire presentation in the light of the studio, I thought it is very important for the studio to really focus on our traditions. You see, I think, and in that sense, I think we have to understand what is democracy, what are democratic institutions, and what is the difference between a pure democracy and a welfare society, welfare, state rather,
Yeah.
which also have been our tradition earlier. Because we were all, in a sense, a welfare state, always under a king or a ruler.
Mm.
But how these, rulers always saw that it was their principal duty to look at the entire, administration as a welfare state. And I think it is also important to examine some of these cities, you see, where this was extremely well, exhibited. Right from, cities in the earlier times in India to even today, for example, how public institutions really gain importance in the cities, even when they were ruled by the state or a ruler. So I think these are very important issues which I think studios should really take up. And, this proposal, which has come up, as you very rightly said, it appears purely as a result of a space program. And you sort of pack it up where you find space. I mean, there is no other, conceptual thinking about this. And some of the worrying aspects of this, if we consider buildings and built environment as representation of any kind of ideology, then, strategically positioning prime minister's office, prime minister's residence in the gaps, which were originally, sort of provided as safe distances between the viceroy and the administrative institution, is also something, which tells us how now, things are going to be in terms of the state authorities. So I think what you expressed is something, which is very relevant. But I think for the studio, the discussions will have to be more on these lines, That is what I feel.
Yeah.
Sorry,
This proximity is, just as an aside, I find it quite ironic that a government who has been talking so much about security has not talked about the security hazard of putting such important functions in such close proximity. But besides democracy, we need to look at, I think we also need to understand what we mean by heritage. And there's a misconception that heritage is an authenticity from the past that we need to carry forward into the present. So it's actually the present intruding in the past, intruding into the present.
Yeah.
But heritage is actually a very contemporary moment of being in the present and looking at the past and saying, what do we choose to remember?
Yeah, for the future.
And, what do we choose to remember? So we can look at exactly the same physical spaces of Central Vista. And we can say we choose not to remember the colonial past. We choose to remember these spaces exactly in the way we've appropriated them since. Sorry,
Prem, you've been here for almost 2 hours, and there are some participant questions, most of which you have actually answered, but there are just a couple which I would like to. One is to ask you if you feel there's an underlying motive to clamp down on public protests. And the other one is to do with, do you think the institutions largely mute? Why are they largely mute about the project? Do they not have enough leverage with the government to make their views heard? In this case, then how democratic are we really?
Yeah, the clampdown has been there, and I don't think we have to admit also that it's not a phenomenon just of this present regime. It dates back to earlier regimes. The attempt to move public protest out of Central Vista comes from earlier regimes. The passage of acts like the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act comes from an earlier regime, although it's being used in a very different way in this regime. So there have been authoritarian impulses that come from quite far back. And in respect to this, I should say a key aspect is that we have no imagination of the city. We tend to think of our culture as being rooted in the village, and the city is only a technical entity. So I think we have to understand the impulse towards impulse behind city life, where its dynamism and creativity really lie, where its ethical ideals should be placed, and how that should determine form, and see what city we choose to imagine. So we tend to look at these spectacles of large projects, modern projects, and say that is the city, even though they represent a minority of the population. Regarding the institutions, I assume he's referring to the architectural institutions. Yeah.
Yes, I assume.
Yeah. A lot of people talk that there are primarily two institutions here, the Indian Institute of Architects and the Council of Architecture. Unfortunately, a lot of the discussion tends to position both of them as equivalent. They are not equivalent. The council is a statutory regulator. It's not a forum of the profession. It's not meant to be. And the council is also not understanding that role. It's trying to act as a forum also. So you see COA social and a whole lot of events there, which I don't think is the right role that the council should take on, because a regulator is meant to serve the general public, not the profession. And it's about setting basic standards of professional licensing to see that if you hire someone who says that they are an architect, you're assured of some minimum threshold. The problems of that regulator also regulating education, but that's a different topic I will not get into here. The Institute of Architects has never acted as a democratic forum. Maybe in its very early years it did, where there was serious discussion. But fine, they organize these events where they get sponsors, and after the event, everyone has a drink and has a good time. But not all of those events are rigorously structured, where there is theoretical reflection, where there is a serious attempt to question architecture. And I think you can realize that problem when you look at the demographics of the Institute. They're close to 1 lakh architects, or maybe it's crossed it must have crossed 1 lakh architects registered with the council so far. Institute membership is under 30,000. So it represents just 30% of the profession to start with. If you look at that, that demographic of the Institute itself, you will find that a vast majority, probably in excess of 80%, are over the age of 45. Young architects are choosing not to join the Indian Institute of Architects. And when I ask them why, the response is, why should I? What do I get out of it? I don't see anything I get out of it. I get so little out of it that if they do occasionally hold an interesting event, I'd rather pay the higher fee for a non-member. So I think they're not, I don't think the people who are leading the Institute of Architects are actually representing, are listening to what the profession wants. And I think actually the profession is actually ready for something more. In 2016, the Karnataka chapter hosted the centenary year National Convention of the IIA. And I was on the executive committee and I acted as a curator of that event, and it was on imagining the Indian city. And for the first time, we had a convention where there were no architects presenting their work. There were no pictures. You could lean back and relax and sort of enjoy as a visual spectacle. And every session was serious. It was philosophically rigorous. And I was worried that there would be, people wouldn't tune into it, but we took the experiment and went ahead. We had what was then the largest convention ever, 1,200 delegates. And almost all of them sat with attention and concentration through all the sessions. So there's clearly a willingness to look. When I delivered the closing note of the convention, as the curator, I was asked to do that. And I chose that opportunity to make this point of the demographic of the institution, that it is not representing the profession and it's not representing the youngsters. And tomorrow, if the youngsters decide, let's create our own forum of architecture, they would probably very, very quickly create a forum whose membership would outstrip that of the institute. Take into account that 20,000 people are graduating every year. And suddenly the institute will suddenly lose its ground of saying we represent the profession. So I think that's another serious problem. I see Nirmal has posted a qualification saying he's also talking about INTAC, ISOLA, IUDI, etc. INTAC is a government-funded body, so I think they're very careful about what they say. I am frankly very disappointed with ISOLA's response. I'm not familiar with IUDI's response on this, but IUDI, I'm disappointed that they have not chosen to take a more public stand on this. And I am disappointed, and I don't know why they have chosen not to do that. Isola did decide to come up with a public statement, which is in the latest LA Journal, but it's, I mean, I don't think I should comment on that. It's just to me, it's just making a bunch of expressing a bunch of broad platitudes, not taking on any of the core issues of what this project is about.
Thank you so much again, Prem. This has been a fantastic morning, and I think just the right time as well in our studio, because we're starting to look at program as an idea, and you've given us 2 hours of your very valuable and precious time, and we thank you for that. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.